So let's talk about what's happening in Australia in terms of COVID. Are you in Sydney? Is that right?
Yeah,
Is it pretty much the same throughout Australia, or does it differ from state to state in terms of policy
it's
or
okay. So
restrictions?
it's similar in the fact that we're all being severely impacted by COVID health orders. So we've all got a similar problem where the states have imposed basically dictatorial rule over us, where they can make any laws they want, and it's resulted in the mass loss of businesses. So small businesses have decreased by a huge percentage because they physically weren't allowed to trade, but the big businesses were. And so they've all had that sort of problem. Everyone's been locked up at one stage or another. There's travel restrictions that come on and come off again. So everyone's been impacted across Australia, but each state has been more or less tyrannical than the other one. So Tasmania's been the least tyrannical. Because they're a little island on their own, they're sort of disconnected from the rest of the politics going on the mainland. But Sydney, for example, tried to play it open for a while, and then public social media pressure and pressure from the states led to us being just severely locked down. And so we ended up with, I think it's been 6 months since the unvaccinated have been allowed to have any kind of a life. And we were promised that on the 1st of December that there'd be no more restrictions on the unvaccinated. So you could work, you could go back to moving around. And so all these people held on. And then our Premier, Dominic Perrottet, came out and said, oh, well, just kidding, it's going to be the 15th of December and 95% vaccination rate. And so then all these kids lost their jobs because obviously employers were like, well, we're not going to hold you for another 15 days. And so everyone loses their jobs. So, and they're also enabling this idea where you can be discriminated against. So instead of saying discrimination will be over after a certain date, they're like, oh, well, businesses can choose to continue discriminating against people after that date, which is really, it's leaving a whole stack of people without work, without a future. Even if they're allowed to travel after that date, they still can't earn a living. And they're also going to start importing thousands of immigrants in to take our jobs off us because there's a job shortage now, because they've sacked all the unvaccinated people. So there's a bit of fury building about that. But in Victoria, which is what most of the news has been talking about, they had the worst lockdowns in the world. And their government's run by Daniel Andrews, who is Labor Party. He's got close connection to the unions. And what happened is he tried to install dictatorial rule over the people of Victoria, which is the ability to claim a pandemic whenever he wants, even if there isn't one, and to make any law or any COVID health order that he wants, including detention without explanation, shutting businesses down, not allowing people to travel, imprisoning people, fines of just huge fines that you could never pay in your entire life. And that's the bill that people have taken to the streets. 500,000 people were there last weekend trying to stop this bill from going through for basically installing him as a dictator. So he's the worst example. But I mean, Daniel McGowan in Western Australia is pretty bad. He's basically locked Western Australia down. It's its own state. You can't go to Western Australia. You can't even get there if you're a resident. That's it. It's closed. They've become like a little island. And the Northern Territory, I only saw this a couple of days ago. Michael Gunner's crazy. He's like totally off the planet. I didn't realize how bad he was until I saw his press conference. Like, wow, I think the Northern Territory might actually be the worst place in Australia right now.
That's crazy. So, what's this bill that they're trying to pass in
Victoria? So
Victoria? Yeah, thanks.
it's a southern state, right? It's at the bottom, not quite Tasmania, but at the bottom of Australia, underneath New South Wales. And it's the pandemic management bill, and it's basically an amendment to an existing bill. So it's about pandemic laws, and it's an emergency health order. So it can ignore every other law that Australia has, and this one supersedes it, except for a few human rights pieces of legislation. It's basically a supreme law, and it allows the Premier to declare a pandemic whenever he wants without having to meet any criteria, just if he feels it's necessary. There doesn't have to be a live virus in Victoria for him to do it. There doesn't have to be any cases in Victoria for him to do it. So he can just say, yep, there's a pandemic, and that allows him to create health orders that he feels are necessary, including discrimination. So he can discriminate against groups of people if he wishes to, including political affiliation. He can lock people, detain people wherever they are for basically indefinite periods of time. He can introduce licenses for general activities so he can stop, for example, an unvaccinated person from being allowed to run certain businesses. He can shut businesses, he can stop travel. Just the laws that he can do are crazy. And the 60 of the big barristers in Victoria wrote an open letter to the minister saying, you can't do this. This is a dictatorship that you're declaring. And so that's why you've got 500,000 people on the street being like, they're marching up to Parliament and they're hosting big rallies on the steps of Parliament House with a lot of the minor party speakers are leading them and a lot of ordinary people trying to stop this bill from going through. And he had the numbers last week, and then it's no point explaining to Canadians so they won't understand, but basically in an act of political revenge, one of his own government came forward and said he was going to vote down the bill because of a personal matter that happened to him. And he lost the numbers. And so now we're all sitting here waiting to see if he'll bring it back, if he's going to table the bill or not. Because if he does, he'll lose and it's gone. So it's the biggest political story in Australia right now. We're trying to stop a dictatorship from happening.
This is so crazy what's going on. And I mean, exactly, it's like these ongoing emergencies that politicians or the party in power is continuing to declare. I mean, they've done this in Canada as well. Just allows them to ignore constitutional rights, ignore the law, and to operate however they like.
Privacy laws, they don't matter. No more privacy.
Yeah, it's really, and to me, it's really scary. And I left Canada as a result of the restrictions and forthcoming crackdown on constitutional rights and free speech and freedom of movement and all of that stuff. But one of the most confusing things to me about this whole situation is that in Canada, at least, most of the population appears to be on board. They re-elected the Liberal government, and Justin Trudeau used things like vaccine mandates and the COVID response and these restrictions as a means to gain political popularity, which is so strange to me because his response and the mandates would lead me never to vote for that party ever again. I wonder, in Australia, is there a lot of support for the lockdowns and the vaccine mandates?
Yeah, so it's happening in Canada too, because it's actually a common narrative for all politics throughout history. So if you can frighten people into something, you'll become popular. It's a great short-term way of gaining power. So yeah, whatever people remain terrified of COVID, if you can sell the terrified narrative well enough, then draconian measures like vaccine passports and discrimination against unvaccinated people, that's popular, but it doesn't last. So it will be popular for maybe 1 or 2 election cycles, but it wears off. This is the thing I was talking about. People follow strength. So if they think they're going to be saved because of this stuff, doesn't matter how crazy it is or how much of it violates your normal rules, people will still vote for it in large enough numbers that they will gain a majority. But the problem with all of this stuff, like every socialist country in the world, once people realize that, one, they're not being kept safe because it just doesn't work, and two, they'd really like to be free again because you get sick of being under dictatorial rule. It all starts to collapse and fall down. So yes, you're right. People will vote for it and it'll look popular, but it's a temporary thing and it does wear off. And it's because, sorry to say, but people are stupid. If you don't recognize that this sort of behavior is irresponsible from a government, like a good government would never sell fear. You never encourage people to be terrified. That's not how responsible governance works. And you never try and strip people's rights away from them to keep them safe. You give them options. You say, well, we're going to provide you with this if you would like it. We'll provide these health services. We'll booster our hospitals. Like, this is how a responsive government acts. Unfortunately, it's hard. That costs money. It takes a bit of intellectual effort to do it, and they won't do it. They'd just rather say, oh, scary, we'll lock you all down. Please vote for us. And so, yes, I think Trudeau's going to have the exact same problem that our political parties are facing now. Look at the rebellion on Australia's streets. Like, everyone thought that we were just complying and that nothing was going to happen. Remember, the whole world was looking at Australia going, why aren't they on the streets? We weren't on the streets because for 2 years we've lost all of our savings. We've lost our businesses. The fines that we were threatened with were crazy. They set up in every state detective squads of policemen to go through social media photographs and hunt down anybody who was videoed at a rally and fine them or imprison them, depending on how serious it was. So people were too scared to be on the streets. It wasn't that they agreed, they weren't silent because they didn't think, but they were terrified they were going to lose their jobs and their homes. And we've been a politically quiet nation our whole lives. We've never had to fight for freedom. Like Canada, we've been pretty calm. And now that they've stopped arresting people for protesting, the first weekend that we were allowed to protest in Sydney, there were 200,000 people on the street. And it was a bad day. It was bad weather, and we all rocked up there. So there's probably going to be twice that here this weekend. And I'll be there. I'll be at that rally this weekend. I wasn't allowed to go last weekend, but I'll be there this weekend. So perception and reality can be different. Just because people are frightened to go out and protest doesn't mean that they agree with the policy, and that's what we're seeing now. All the quiet people feel safe enough from their government, not from the COVID, from the government, to go out and say, actually, no, we do not support what you're doing. We're not going to continue discriminating. And the tide, you can feel very strongly in Australia that the tide of public opinion has turned. As soon as it got hot, people didn't want to wear their masks. So it's hot in Australia. Like, we're not going to wear masks in 40-degree heat. It's not going to happen. We're sick of not seeing our family. It's turning. I don't know about Canada, but we've definitely turned a corner down here.